Ed Miliband.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for her reply? Mr. Speaker, people can believe that the tactics of Extinction Rebellion are right or wrong, and the Minister obviously believes they're wrong. But the demonstrators are certainly not wrong about the failure of politics to do anything like what is necessary to fight climate change. They are right. The Minister said in her reply that we made progress as a country, and I thank her for what she said about me. But the truth is the planet is warming far faster than we are acting. Even the Paris commitments, the path-breaking Paris commitments, will take us way beyond the disaster of 2 degrees of warming, as the Minister knows. And the truth is, Mr. Speaker, climate change is not some theoretical future prospect, but is with us here and now. Wildfires, droughts, floods. And we have been warned by the scientists. It will get far worse if we do not act with much greater urgency. Now, in these circumstances, Mr. Speaker, it is no wonder people are disrupting the traffic and school children are striking. And the response from government cannot simply be to restore order and say it's doing a good job. The only credible answer of democratic politics in response to these protests is to admit that we need to raise our game and show we can act. So can I therefore ask the Minister today to commit to the following 4 actions as a down payment on what is necessary? First, will she seek to persuade the Prime Minister to declare a climate emergency, as many local authorities have done, to focus minds across government on the centrality of this issue to every department, not just hers? And, Mr. Speaker, goodness knows this is necessary, because we know from the figures that came out just before Easter that the government is woefully behind in meeting the 4th and 5th carbon budgets covering the next decade. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, she is to be commended for asking the Climate Change Committee to recommend a date when the UK will need to hit zero emissions, which they will do next week. But these recommendations cannot be allowed to be buried in Whitehall. So will she now commit to respond formally to them before the summer recess? Only by Britain showing world leadership again quickly can we hope to persuade other countries to act. Third, will she commit to working on the delivery of a British Green New Deal at scale, which could have the effect of giving work to hundreds of thousands of people across our country, for example, retrofitting buildings, and showing beyond doubt that economic justice and climate justice go together? Fourth and finally, will she take up the idea of Extinction Rebellion and others to involve the public in these discussions about both the threat of climate change and the action necessary, and yes, the trade-offs with a process of citizen deliberation? Because the truth is that for too long, and this covers both parties, people have been shut out of the climate debate and made to feel powerless, and this must change. Mr. Speaker, let me say this finally. Greta Thunberg, who is with us today in the public gallery, said this: "I want you to act as you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if our house is on fire, because it is." Mr. Speaker, she is right. If we do not act, people will say in the future, you knew the facts, but you did not care enough. We will be known as the generations with the knowledge of what was to come, but without the will or imagination to prevent it. We will be condemned, and rightly so. The right response to rebellion on our streets is to produce a revolution in climate leadership, and the time for action is now.
The right to protest is one of the foundations of our freedom. From the Chartists to the suffragettes, the civil rights movement to anti-apartheid, all of those victories were won by citizens uniting against injustice, making their voice heard. And Extinction Rebellion and the school climate strikers are doing just that. And I too thank the police for the way in which they have policed the demonstrations on the whole with good humour. I was delighted to meet the demonstrators at Marble Arch yesterday, and I thank them for speaking the truth. Many of us listened to Greta Thunberg earlier today. She spoke about truth. The truth that we're in the midst of an ecological and climate emergency. And she also spoke about our refusal, our fear to acknowledge the truth that stopping this catastrophe requires a complete rethink in the way that we run our economy, so that GDP growth is no longer the touchstone. We are on track for catastrophic levels of global warming. Yet in the UK, we pride ourselves on the 40% reductions in emissions we say we've achieved below 1990 levels, whilst achieving a 72% increase in GDP. But the truth is out there. School children are teaching it to us. Those figures do not include aviation or shipping emissions. They do not include our imports or exports, and they've largely come from the Clean Power Directive in the European Union, which forced us to announce an end to coal-fired power stations. That's why thousands of our school children are on climate strike. They know that we are not acting with the speed and the seriousness that the climate emergency demands. So I ask the Minister, will she listen to the voice of Extinction Rebellion and of our own children? I echo the call from my right honourable friend. Will she join my party in declaring a national environmental and climate emergency and commit to bringing forward the government's response to the Committee on Climate Change's recommendations to achieve net zero urgently when they are published shortly? Will she do more to engage with the public in tackling the climate crisis? Because it's clear that our citizens need to be in the driving seat for a sustainable future. And will she work with Treasury colleagues and the Bank of England to address what Mark Carney has identified as climate-related financial risks and make the emissions curve and natural capital the key elements of our future economic viability? Because we know that however disruptive the climate demonstrations may have been in this past few weeks to businesses, they pale into insignificance against the capacity of climate disasters to wipe out human prosperity and human life itself. Yeah.